51 years ago from last night, I was converted to Christianity. 51 years ago, I came to a saving knowledge of the Lord Jesus. Amen. 51 years. So we're starting a new year, a new day today. We are in the end of Revelation 8. So are we really to understand the first three trumpets as we've understood them? To expect as the fulfillment of these trumpets a big lightning and hailstorm for the first one? We're in the second half of Revelation 8. A meteorite that hits the sea somewhere, and a comet that has a tail on fire that's dropping poisonous, noxious debris and gases and material on fresh water. You know, I know that those are some really extreme events, and they get more extreme as you go from the first one to the second one to the third one. Of course, the lightning storm, we won't have any problem with that. Sure, there have been lightning storms before. The destruction of that was pretty widespread somewhere, that it burned up all the trees and the green grass in that area. But then as you go to a meteorite, well, yeah, meteorites have fallen. That's happened before. That's not too far out of the ordinary to expect. A comet, well, we haven't had comets flying around the equator, dropping off poisonous gases. So I know these are extreme events. And I don't expect everyone to agree, with my interpretation. And if someone is unhappy, I would be happy to invite them to come up with their own. And I don't mean that in the sense of, if you don't like mine, let's see if you can do better. I don't mean that at all. I mean, these are difficult events that we are expected to believe. It's either my interpretation or some other one. I mean, that's what it's somebody's. And these are difficult things. And I say that now because it's only going to get more incredulous as we go along. Wait till we get to chapter 9. And if you think that your limit to believe has been stretched to the maximum, what are we going to do with chapter 9? So these early trumpets, we're working our way toward things that will just take us to something new that will tempt us towards incredulity even more when we see what Revelation 9 has to say, that will give us the fifth and the sixth blowing of the trumpet and the events that follow. So without me saying, there are all kinds of interpretations of the seals and the trumpets. They're just all kinds of interpretations. I would like to think that we could put all of the interpretations under one of two categories. The first category would be the category of those interpretations that try to find real meaning in the text. Yeah. And those that don't would be the second category. If I wanted to divide up all the different opinions, views, and interpretations, what do you think the first trumpet, the third trumpet, the second trumpet, the fourth, what do you think that means? Well, this person has this view, and she has hers, and he has his. I think we could divide them all up and put them in one of two categories. Those attempts to find real meaning in the text, and those that don't care. Those that don't even look for real meaning in the text. And so it's that second group that really predominates. Because when you look at some of these things, that's why I'm starting tonight with the incredulous nature of the results of these early trumpets. When you look at what you think it means, and therefore what you are asked to believe that this is going to happen, it's a pretty big thing that we're asked to believe. And so most people consequently just don't even go down that path. And for some reason, they want to find something odd and strange, something that I would say, isn't an attempt to find a real meaning in the passage. So for instance, if you were a European scholar in the end of the 1700s or early 1800s, and you were writing a commentary on the book of Revelation, and I say a European scholar because our country was barely founded, so we didn't have a plethora of biblical teachers or scholars here in the United States yet, but works were being done in Europe. Then the people who were writing commentaries and they're looking at these convulsions that are happening in the world would tend then to have seen a reflection of what they were experiencing. And in Europe, it was the French Revolution. And so they would see just incredible things happen that they had not seen before. It was the rise of Napoleon. It's the same time period that Charles Dickens was addressing in his book, A Tale of Two Cities. You know how that famous book opens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the best of times in London, it was the worst of times in Paris, hence the two cities there. And why it was the worst of times in Paris was because of the French Revolution. And so consequently, as they're writing their commentaries, they're seeing these convulsions resulting from the trumpets as maybe being fulfilled in something that's happening around them. I think that is always a danger of reading the Bible in your right hand and reading the newspaper in your left hand. When you've got them like that, the temptation for most people is to, because we tend to be self-centered and self-focused, we tend to want to find the Bible having meaning for right now. So if I can look in my newspaper and see something, maybe it is actually a fulfillment of some prediction in prophecy in either the Old or the New Testament. I don't think that's a good way to go, but I think that is the way that so many people do. And so when you end up with, going back to our last week's study and the last verse we looked at, verse 11, and the name of this star is called wormwood. When you end up with a quasi-technical word that is very mysterious and in most people's minds and cryptic, then they're going to begin to search for what could be the possible meaning of this word wormwood, and what is this star to which it refers. Now, we looked last week in the Old Testament at some passages because this is a unique word in the New Testament, but it's just a Greek translation of a very common word in the Old Testament that actually was translated wormwood back there as well. I don't know that I ever even made the point that I needed to make because we were looking at the passages where it was found, but it refers to a plant in Israel that's called wormwood. It's an herb or plant that if you were tried to eat it, it can be very, not poisonous, it won't kill you, but it's very, very bitter tasting. And so where we saw that used in Jeremiah, in the prophets in the Old Testament, where we saw that used is where God was saying, he was using that term wormwood, referring to a plant that everyone would be aware of, and simply telling them that to depart from the way of righteousness and truth will be to have the result of a very bitter end in your life. So it was just an analogy, a symbol, a reference point drawn from the world around them. And I think that's exactly why it's being used over here in the book of Revelation. That it simply is referring to the fact that the nations of the world who themselves have forsaken God, then this star, God has named it wormwood, and we think that it is probably a comet because it has a long lit tail like a torch behind it, and it is damaging freshwater sources in the areas over which it flies. But not only is it turning the water bitter, and it is, that's bad enough, but it's obviously more than bitter because look at the end of verse 11, and many men died. That's not the normal result of tasting wormwood. So this has taken this idea a step further. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. They were made bitter to the point of being poisonous. My only connection besides the passages in the Bible to wormwood is many years ago, I was teaching in my church I think it was a Wednesday night series where I took one of the very popular works of the English writer C.S. Lewis, which was entitled Screwtape Letters, and did a long series on that. And what Screwtape Letters was about, it's about the art of temptation. So a senior devil whose name was Screwtape was instructing a junior devil, his nephew, whose name was Wormwood. So he had obviously pulled that name out of the Bible. That's just the genius of C.S. Lewis, to pull that name out and say, that's going to be the name of this junior devil. So that was besides the Bible, my only use of that word. But going back to what I was saying a moment ago, if we look at all of these various attempts to interpret, what are these trumpets talking about? What is this star? Why is it called wormwood? What does that mean? Then if we don't let the text be our control, then it's just fair game for just about anything. There is a pastor on the East Coast. He's a very well-known pastor, got a big church. He loves to teach on eschatology. He did a series on the book of Revelation, and he was actually in my mind a few weeks ago when I made the comment that not everybody has the opportunity and the time to be as detailed as I am, and I understand that. I thankfully have the luxury to do that. Maybe a pastor in a church doesn't feel he has the luxury, although actually he does, because I attended a church last week where that pastor has been teaching Luke for 2 years. 2 years, and he's in, what I tell you, chapter 17. He's in chapter 17. So you can do it if you decide to do it. And if you don't, that's fine. But the problem, if you don't, this often happens. So he taught all of chapter 8, this pastor on the East Coast I'm talking about, taught all of chapter 8 in one message. And there's a lot here to run through. And he did a fairly decent job. He didn't hack the chapter to pieces by any means. You'd walk away understanding general ideas. Of course, he had a third of all of the grass in the world has been burned up, and a third of all the fresh water, and a third of all the salt water. So they haven't really sat down to think, is that realistic in light of just normal reality? And then he got to wormwood. And I thought, oh no, I know how these prophecy preachers are. And although I think he is a well-meaning and a good brother, I know, because I've heard his other teachings, he wants to have the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other. And he loves to talk about Putin all the time, and about United States government, and about China, he just wants to talk about this stuff all the time. And he'll do it. It's okay to talk about that, but it's not okay if in talking about it, as you're teaching, you're somehow leading people to think that there is a connection, and that you are fairly certain there is a connection, and here's the verse that makes that connection between Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader, and something in the Bible. Maybe Vladimir Putin is something, I don't know, but there's nothing in the Bible that tells us that. So for you to talk about it in this context presents a problem. So back to wormwood. So he did say that he didn't know if what this star was, but he said it's something that causes a poisonous effect in a third of the world's freshwater sources. So we'll give him a pass on that, At least he's right on it's something causing this. And then after he said that, he said, now, what's interesting is, he said, I have in front of me here, this is a front page article from the New York Times. And it was an article about Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster that happened in the Ukraine. And this dear pastor loves to talk about Russia and the Ukraine. And so he's talking about Chernobyl, and then he says this, and he said, and do you know what? In the Ukrainian language, the word that Chernobyl would translate into is wormwood. And so I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's not a good way to go about teaching the Bible. Because even though you did make a distinction, and you really did say Chernobyl doesn't have anything to do with anything, then you bring that into it. You know that there was radioactive fallout because of that, and he just read that article and gave the statistics that I don't think anyone can live in that area for the next 1,500 years or something like that. So it is a poisonous, radioactive area. I don't think it's good to make these kinds of connections. So here's the sentence I came up with in light of all this. In light of, I want you to continue to think. You don't have to accept my interpretation of these trumpets at all. But I challenge you in a joyful way, come up with a better one. And I will switch from my view to your view. But it's got to be controlled by the text. We can't just make it mean anything. And as I think I said after last week's message, I have seen that wormwood means anything from cryptocurrency to some biological weapon created in a laboratory somewhere, and everything in between. So here's the statement. If we free ourselves from the internal constraints of the text, then the only limitation we have to our interpretation is our own imagination. Right. It's as simple as that.
But as many people as you have in the world, that's how many different interpretations. Every man for himself, or every woman for themselves. Unless
someone decided to share someone else's belief. And then we have the total number -1. If we don't allow the internal constraints of the text to be our guide, our helper, our filter, our aid, our boss, the text needs to be the boss and we need to be the servant. If we don't do that, then I said the only limitation to our interpretation is your own imagination of what could possibly be meant. So we just don't have any safeguards. And I say that in light of where we're headed here very shortly in the next couple of weeks. Our temptation towards incredulity will only increase as we continue to read this book. With that being said, let's read tonight together Revelation chapter 8 and verse 12. We are on the fourth trumpet. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. So, let me start by saying this, that I don't have a whole lot to say about the fourth trumpet because I don't know a whole lot about the fourth trumpet. And I hope the reason that I don't know a lot about it is because I haven't been told very much about it. Notice there's not a lot said. These previous trumpets, you can figure out some of the details because it tells us something about hail and fire being thrown to the earth, mingle with blood, and then a third of the trees were burned up. You can see a hail and lightning storm in that, and so is the case with the second and with the third. So we're just not told very much about this, but let's see what we are told. And you can be pondering and meditating on this verse as I talk for the rest of tonight. I'll read it one more time. A third part of the sun was smitten, a third part of the moon, a third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. So we're going to look at it as we've been looking at it in these four categories. What is the object of this trumpet? What is the means? What is the result? of the trumpet being blown? And then fourthly, what are the net effects? The object, the means, the result, the net effect. So again, just a moment, and that is all we have on the object. Recognize that we've moved from the land around us being burned up or around wherever that lightning storm happened. We've moved from that. We've moved from salt water, which was impacted by a meteorite. We moved from fresh water. Those were the three areas so far. It was the earth, then salt water, then fresh water that had been affected by these trumpets. Now we've moved in the third place to what I would call the daytime and nighttime sky. The daytime and nighttime sky. In the second place, the means. We're not told how this was accomplished. We're simply told that the sun was smitten. This is a Greek word that looks like this, which you don't have to remember. P-L-E-S-S-O, pleso. The reason you don't have to remember it's because it's not a very common word in the New Testament. Actually, this is the only place that it does occur. It's used in the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, in an interesting place. It's used in the plagues on Egypt look at Exodus chapter 9, towards the very end of Exodus 9. This word pleso, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint translators chose to use that word in the context of one of the plagues. And interestingly enough, it would go back to the first trumpet because it's back to what was damaged by hail. But in Exodus 9 and verse 31, the flax and the barley were smitten, pleso. Not in the Hebrew, but in the Greek translation of the Old. The barley was in the ear and the flax was bolled, but the wheat and the rye were not smitten, for they were not grown up. Because this word in the New Testament is what we call a hapex legomenon. Do you remember what that fancy technical phrase means? I've used it here many times. What's a hapex legomenon? It's only used one time. A word is only used one time. If something is a hapex legomenon, it's a unique word, which means you don't have any other place in the New Testament to go and say, well, let's see how else this is used, and let's see how we can come up with our meaning. That's a problem if you have a rare word. And you have plenty of Greek words that are rare and plenty of Hebrew words that you have no other material in the Bible itself to go and find that. Now here, we've gone back to the Old Testament, but again, it's not in Hebrew. It's simply what the Septuagint translators chose to use to refer to what happened to some of the grain on the earth.
And they were translating from Hebrew.
They were translating from Hebrew, trying to give it the word that they thought met or satisfied the meaning of the Hebrew word. And so they chose the same word that ended up being used by John over here in Revelation 8. So it said that the sun was smitten. Notice also, it said a third part of the sun was smitten. And do you see the next phrase, and the third part of the moon? Well, the third part of the moon, what? Well, obviously you supply the verb. We call that an ellipsis in any kind of language study. You supply the verb that was given to you earlier. The sun, a third part of the sun was smitten. Then you supply, as you read in your mind, a third part of the moon was smitten, and a third part of the stars were smitten. But we don't know in what way God struck or smote them. Struck is another word. I think some of your other translations may have struck. A third part of the sun was struck. Something, somehow, and we know this, we trace this all back to the hand of God, but how was he able to smite or strike a third part of the sun, the moon, the stars? in the third place tonight. Results. See, I don't have a lot to say because we're not given a lot. At this point, the verse becomes a little harder to understand exactly what are we being told. You've read it a few times tonight. You probably read it before you came tonight. What's happening? What are we being told? What are we being told?
Light is being diminished.
Okay.
That's kind of the end result of it all.
So,
light isn't the same as it usually is, in the daytime or in the nighttime.
yes, that's right.
But it's not completely cut off. It's only
Right.
But it's not completely cut off. So I think when we're first reading the verse, the first part of it, what I look at is, are we talking about, there's two different things. What are we talking about? Are we talking about intensity versus, are we talking about availability?
It seems like availability because of the two words shown not.
See, now we're getting into the second half of the verse, which probably helps us interpret the first half of the verse.
Shown not means
Is it intensity or is it availability? Is it, in other words, is the result dimness or darkness? I think when we're first reading the first part of the verse, we might think dimness. But by the time we get to the second half of the verse, then maybe we are thinking more darkness. And we need the whole verse to be able to interpret it. Are you following what I'm saying? How there are two different ways maybe to interpret this? So here's a good analogy, I think, maybe if you're not understanding. Let's just say, for sake of argument and for sake of round figures, that a day is made up of 24 hours, right? Let's just say every day has 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. That we know the sun has been smitten. We don't know exactly what that means and how that was accomplished. But if we have 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, does this verse tell us that during those 12 hours of daylight, it's just a little dimmer and it's just a little hazier? That's one interpretation. Or is it saying, no, it's not about the availability.
the intensity.
It's not about the intensity. It's about how many of those 12 hours do we actually have light. And if it's the second part, the availability and the darkness instead of intensity and dimness, then rather than having 12 hours, now we only have 8 hours. So the verse is very difficult to interpret. A third part of the sun was smitten. Do we think by that somehow if we drew a picture of the sun up here and God just took a third of it and destroyed it and threw it in the garbage can, we know, well, that can't be, because we would all freeze to death. We have to have the sun. We have to have the full power of the sun, even if it has to still be in existence, even if we don't have all of its light. If the sun ceased to be the sun, it is the size it is, the shape it is, the power it is, and the distance it is, 93 million miles, 1 AU from the earth, in order for us not to freeze and not to catch on fire. Mm-hmm. We're at the perfectly correct and right location.
Maybe from a physics standpoint, he could smite 1/100th of the sun in the sense that just remove 100, so it only has 99/100ths left, and we could still survive barely, maybe a little bit too cold.
But not 30, not 30%.
Yeah.
So it seems to be that what the verse is saying is that we will have 1/3 less daylight and we will have 1/3 less night light. And anything that affects daytime and darkness has always frightened people. Whether there's a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, anything that happens as far as the sun and the moon and the stars and the sky and darkness versus light, that's always an issue for everyone. We happen to have just passed, by the way, December 21st. We're on January 1st. December 21st is what? That is the winter equinox, the winter solstice.
Longest day.
it is the shortest
We're
day
getting longer.
and the longest night of the year.
Yeah.
And no one likes that day. You would rather have June the 21st. You have the longest possible day and the shortest possible night. The thing I've always loved about the winter solstice being in December and late December, we still have 2 cold, hard winter months ahead of us, January and February. That's the bad news. The good news is every day is getting longer. Even in the worst time of the year, every day is getting longer. But unfortunately, when you get to June the 21st and you think, well, I've got all the rest of the summer and the fall, from that point on, whether it's 10 seconds or 30 seconds, you have less daylight and more night.
And then when they go back an hour in the fall, which is ridiculous, then you really got a lot less.
Then both we and the groundhogs are all confused. What are the net effects of this happening? We're saying it's affecting the nighttime and daytime sky. Well,
this means that a third of the day, where normally there would be light, is just pitch black. And a third of the night, where normally the moon will be shining, it's also pitch black. So that means 8 hours out of the 24 hours, it's pitch black. Where normally no hours out of the 24 hours is it pitch black. You either at night and you got the moon's light, or you're in the day and you got the sun's. That's different for the world. We've never experienced that.
well, yes, as I think I said earlier, it means out of the 24 hours, we have 8 hours of daylight. We have 8 hours of daylight because everything is dark. We have more darkness and we have less light. So our 12 hours of daylight, if we divide the day in half, 12 and 12, we no longer have 12 hours of light. Now 4 of those hours have been overtaken with some darkness.
Right. But 4 of the 12 in the daytime are completely black, and 4 of the 12 in the nighttime are completely black with no moon's light. So
Right.
8 out of the total 24 hours are black. Whereas before that, 0 out of the 24 hours were completely black. Because in the 12 hours at night, you had the moon's light, and in 12 hours a day, all 12, you had the sun's light. Is that true?
And we still have, though, even with this happening, we still have starlight because only a third of the stars were smitten. So we
that's
still
true.
have
So
we still have some starlight.
I didn't
You
consider
didn't-
that.
It's a difficult verse to interpret. So let's look at the net effects. And again, we're left to hypothesize what are the possible results from this. If we go back to the first trumpet, we know a third of the green grass was burned up. We're not actually told anybody died, but you could probably hypothesize with lightning strikes, probably somebody died. We're not told that. The second one, where the meteorite, which John's witnessed as a mountain on fire falling from the sky and hitting some salty sea somewhere, we're 100% certain some people died there because it's said a third of the ships were destroyed. So we know people died there. With the third trumpet, it says many men died from wormwood. We know that. We're not told anybody dies from this event. I can't see how they could, unless they tripped and fell in the dark when they were expecting light and they went off the edge of a cliff. But I mean, as a whole, it doesn't seem like the net effect is the loss of human life. Again, we're left to hypothesize. It simply doesn't say. But let's look at some things that we do know from the scriptures concerning this whole theme of darkness. In the first place, this is definitely reminiscent of the 9th plague on the Egyptians. Turn back to Exodus chapter 10. So often we will see this to be the case as we work our way through the trumpets and through the bowls, that some of them hearken our thoughts back to the plagues on the Egyptians. And so it's almost as, well, I'll save that for later. Look at Exodus chapter 10. I think this is the 9th plague, Exodus 10 and verse 21. The Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. And we're not told how this was divinely affected or caused. And we don't have to worry about that, whether God just supernaturally created darkness, whether he was able to do something with the heavenly luminaries, because remember the verse in James, he is the Father of lights. He is the one who owns, created, and controls all the lights in James 1. So we don't know how this was accomplished. We just know that there was darkness. And it was a darkness that was more than just darkness. Because look at the end of the verse. Even a darkness which may be felt.
Oh, something supernaturally different than normal darkness.
It's very creepy. It's very eerie. It's very scary.
Otherwise,
And then let's face it, we just don't like darkness as a human. We'd prefer the light versus the darkness. This is a darkness that could even be felt. So Moses, in obedience to the Lord, stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. And here was the net effect of that. So I would assume we could extrapolate and bring that net effect, because it's just common sense, over to some net effects to be experienced by the blowing of the fourth trumpet. And they saw not one another, neither rose anyone from his place for 3 days. Who wants to get up and do anything? But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. That's interesting. We'll need that, and we will use that later in some of our studies. So it is definitely, this fourth trumpet is definitely reminiscent of the ninth plague on Egypt, where there was a darkness that could be felt. So I would assume, although I'm not told, so all I can do is assume and hypothesize, is there is more to what people are going to experience than what we've been told here in this verse. Just to make it dark, well, anybody can get through a day or two of darkness. But if there is something else attached to it, such as a darkness that may be felt, that was so eerie and so scary and so frightening that people just stayed put and didn't do a thing, then if that's true back then, that well could be true in the future.
I have a question.
Yes.
The first three trumpets, the results and the net effects were felt not globally, but in certain areas, geographic areas on the earth. We can deduce that. However, do you think the effects of the fourth trumpet are global, or when it says a third, the day shone not for a third part of it, that in the night likewise, that means at a certain place on earth, in a certain geographic location, like say Alaska, those things are true, but in Madagascar, it's normal?
It's a really good question.
It doesn't tell us.
And I don't know. I wonder the same myself. And on the one hand, it seems like it's more global since it's the sun and the moon and the stars. But because the others have been definitely localized, maybe this is localized as well. And we've got to keep in mind, we still have 2 more trumpets to look at and try to determine now, are they local or are they global? So it's hard to say everything you want to say about one until you cover all of your bases. But I mean, that's a really good question. We just wished it gave us more information to know this is definitely something that's localized. We know in Egypt it was localized, that it just affected the Egyptians. Okay, here in the second place, a comment I want to make is that one thing we do know from Scripture is that darkness is always a sign of divine displeasure and judgment. More darkness is God is more displeased, and more light is you are walking on the right path. And we're going to look at some verses. Some of these we've already studied before. If you'll turn back to Amos chapter 5, verses 18 to 20. Darkness is always a sign of divine displeasure. This was one of my early in my teenage years memory verses, so I could quote this probably to this day pretty easily, but we'll turn back there and look at it together. And we've looked at these verses, this one and other ones, Amos chapter 5, verses 18 through 20, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos. It's toward the beginning of the minor prophets, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos. We looked at these verses when we were looking at the sixth seal and Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord. And my point I'm making now is that darkness is a sign things are not going well. Verse 18 of Amos 5, woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord, because the Israelites thought they knew that the day of the Lord is a triumphant day when God, Messiah, will come and rescue and redeem the nation of Israel. That's what they were looking forward to. And the prophet Amos said, you might have the cart before the horse. That the day of the Lord will be a good day for people that are in fellowship with him, and it will be a bad day for those who aren't. And that's what he's going to say. Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light. And he gives a couple of allusions to events they would be familiar with. As if a man did flee from a lion. He's being chased by a lion. And he finally got away from him only to be met by a bear. Or he escaped into the house from the bear and leaned his hand on the wall and a serpent bit him.
In other words, you can't get away from that day.
Shall not the day of the Lord be darkness and not light? He asks the question. Shall it not be darkness and not light? Shall it not be even very dark and no brightness in it? I'm not saying the fourth trumpet is the day of the Lord. I'm just saying that darkness is always a sign of divine displeasure. And the fourth trumpet is just going to be a prelude to this darkness that we have reference to in these verses that will come shortly. Turn back a little earlier to prophecy of Joel. That'll be easy to find. Joel 2, end of verse 1. The day of the Lord cometh. It's nigh. Verse 2. Joel 2:2. It's a day of darkness and gloominess. A day of clouds and thick darkness. That's the day of the Lord. That's what precedes the second coming of Christ. That's what the scriptures say. It will be a day of darkness before his glorious light dawns. Then back in Isaiah 13, verses 9 and 10. I think all of these are verses we have looked at before, and we will look at them surely again. Isaiah 13:9. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, it's cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. We've been reading a little of that. Remember, the day of the Lord is not a 24-hour period of time. It's an event whose duration is not specified. It is an event that lasts for years. But it all begins with the beginning of the tribulation and goes all the way through the end. And so, what have we been reading about in the seals and the trumpets? Cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. That's exactly what we've been reading about. Prior to the actual coming of Christ, the day of the Lord is still in effect. And he will destroy the sinners thereof out of it. Some sinners have been destroyed by drinking the water poisoned by wormwood. The stars of heaven and constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine.
And that's happened somewhat in Trumpet 4.
It's happening somewhat right there.
It happened even more fully after Trumpet 4 if you read later.
That's right. But the sign, the context of all of this is not a happy context. Everyone's not saying, oh, this is great.
Right.
No, look at verse 9. The context is cruel with wrath and fierce anger.
For the sinners.
For the sinners when you're experiencing this period of darkness.
Right.
And then if we want to flip over to the New Testament in Mark's Gospel, we've looked a lot at Matthew, so we will look at a parallel account in Mark's Gospel, chapter 13, just verses 24 and 25. In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars of heaven will fall, and the powers that are in heaven will be shaken. And those are all obviously eschatological verses and references. But turn over to Luke 23, and here's one that is not in that same context or in that same vein. in Luke 23 and verse 44. This is our Lord hanging on the cross, experiencing the crucifixion just prior to his death. And what is one of the signs of the divine anger of God against what has been done to his precious and unique Son?
Darkness.
It was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. The sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. It was torn in half. You know, it's just a dreadful event that the innocent, holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, made higher than the heavens, the writer of Hebrews said, is hanging on a cross,
Amen.
killed by cruel and angry sinners. And so this is a definite sign of divine displeasure, that for 3 hours there is a period of darkness, at least over Jerusalem and maybe at least over the land of Palestine. And if it extended further, we don't have any way of knowing that. A third point I want to make about the business of darkness versus light is, as we study Scripture, we realize that Satan's whole kingdom is one of darkness. God dwells in unapproachable light. And what does he say of his followers? We are children of the light, and don't be children of the darkness. While we're in Luke, look in Luke 22 and verse 53. Jesus, before he goes to the cross, is addressing the religious authorities, and he said, when I was daily with you in the temple, I was available. You didn't stretch forth your hands against me then. Why now? He says, because this is your hour and the power of darkness. Judas had betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver, and now it was the time to go to the cross. And Jesus said, now this is the hour that belongs to the power of darkness. And who is the one who controls, whose kingdom is a kingdom of darkness? Look over in Acts 26. We'll just read these verses quickly without much comment on them. Paul before King Agrippa in Acts 26:17. God had appeared to him to deliver him from the people, from the Gentiles, unto whom now I send thee, to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God. Darkness goes with Satan, light goes with God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them that are sanctified by faith that is in Jesus. Colossians 1:13 talks about the power or the kingdom of darkness. Then if you would turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where the Apostle Paul is going all the way back in his mind. He sees all of these things in the Old Testament as just, shadowy figures and he sees interesting ways to interpret them. Not that he takes anything away from the actual account, but he goes back to the account of creation. And after God created, Genesis 1, verses 1, 2, and 3, after God created the earth in its not current state as a sphere, darkness covered the face of the deep, we're told, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And what was the very first thing God said? The very first thing he did? Let there be light. And there was light. And Paul, there's something good about the light. There's something not so good about darkness. And so Paul goes back to that very beginning, and he says in 2 Corinthians 4:3, if our gospel be hidden, it's hidden to them that are lost. That's why they can't see it. It's not because it isn't good and bright and there and available. It's hidden because they're lost. And here's why they can't: in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. We preach not ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness. Genesis 1, 1-3. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, Paul says he's done the same thing in our hearts. He has shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And I don't have to labor that point. If we go over and look at like the first epistle of John, all John is talking about is we're disciples of the light, be children of the light. And he said, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of his son Jesus cleanses us from all sin. That's in 1 John chapter 1. I don't remember what verse. And he talks about that over and over and over in 1 John.
Right.
If we walk in the light as he is in the light, then we have fellowship with one another, and then we have fellowship with God. So, as I close tonight, back to Revelation 8 and back up in our minds to think what's happening in this fourth trumpet is more darkness. More darkness is never a good thing. It always puts people on edge. We human beings weren't made to live in darkness, just like we weren't made to live in water. We're going to see the subject of water come up on some future occasions here in Revelation, and we've seen it a little bit in the past. And, we're land creatures, and people naturally are afraid of what? They're afraid of the water. That's a natural fear. And they're afraid of what? The dark. That's just a natural fear. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. We're not made for the water. There are countless creatures out there that love the ocean because they're suited and fitted and created for that. And they just swim and dive and do whatever they want to do. Now, we're not afraid of a kiddie's pool or a little stream or maybe a pond or maybe a lake if it's small enough. And the ocean, well, we're not really afraid of any water as long as we have a boat or a PFD. But you get without those two things, and the water is a scary place. We're not made. We can only stay above the surface so long, and when we go below it, we die. That's exactly what's happening to Jonah in his whole ordeal, in his little prophecy. He's been thrown overboard by the other sailors because he knew it's for my sake that this whole storm has come. And if you'll throw me overboard, you guys will be safe and I'll be whatever happens to me. And they did, and that was the result. The storm stopped as soon as they got rid of the guy that should not have been on the boat. He should have been over in Nineveh preaching. He went the wrong direction. And when they threw him overboard, he swam as long as he could, and then he sank. And the only thing that preserved his life was a great fish that was prepared, we're told, by the Lord, came by and engulfed him. And that's how he was able to live. The fish loved being in the ocean. Jonah, not so much. And the darkness is the same for us. There are animals out there that love the darkness because they can see in the dark. And we can't. We don't have night vision. We don't have, as you look out in the field and you see the deer and you see their eyes reflecting, or you see your kitty cat's eyes, or the fish I talked about a few weeks ago, the sauger that I like to go catch this time of year. They have that same little reflective covering on the back of their eye. And what that does is it reflects any available light back to the eye where they can gather some more vision of it. We don't have that. When we go out in the dark, it's just plain dark. But when horses, they have that reflective thing, cows, coyotes, a lot of wildlife have that in their eyes because they need that. Darkness for us is a huge disadvantage. We can't navigate, we can't see, we're uneasy, we're unsure, we're afraid, we're feeling around. To be afraid of the dark is a natural fear, every bit as much as to be afraid of water. And so what's happening here with this fourth trumpet, beyond whatever the supernatural aspect is that I don't know and we're not told about, is just what I could reasonably figure out myself, that it makes people very uneasy and it kind of shuts life down. How long will this last? We're not told. How widespread is it? We're not told. If it tends to last, then you have things like the growth of crops to be concerned about. You have energy output. You have navigation. You know, in the old days, you navigated by the sun and the moon and the stars. You say, well, we have global positioning satellites today. We do today, but I don't know how long they will last during the tribulation period, because things are going to be upset both on earth and in heaven. So you lose your ability to navigate, you lose warmth, you lose mental health, mental well-being. I cannot imagine the people that have found a way to live in the far reaches of Alaska or Canada, where you have so much darkness for such a long period of time. It's not a normal way to have to live. Most human beings, if they had their choice, they would prefer more daylight and less darkness, simply because we're comfortable there. And I want to close with this, because again, I don't have a lot to say. There's nothing more to say about this, except to leave you with just the thought, work it out in your own mind. So what are the other negative effects of a lack of daylight, of the sun, the moon, the stars being struck or smitten so that we only have 8 hours of daylight instead of our normal 12? Could there be positive results that come from this? What about, and I'm not saying this is true, but I'm just trying to think, God has so many ways, so many things to accomplish, sometimes by doing the same thing.
Right.
What could be a curse for one person could be a blessing for another. And it's almost like what I was going to say earlier tonight. Whenever, God put darkness on Egypt, but he gave light to the Israelites. He has a way of being able to do both of those. There are going to be hard times that I cannot even begin to imagine. I can only read the pages of Revelation that talk about it. Hard times for the people of God. Hard times for God's children, and hard times for the nation of Israel, not yet regenerate. So one of the good things that can come from darkness is it provides a time and an opportunity for people to escape. If you are being pursued by enemies, I know God has other ways. He could also cause you to be protected and be safe, but it's just a thought. Maybe some of the darkness will help some of God's people not be found and be preserved as a result. And you can fill in all of the rest of the details, because that's all I've got.
Believe, only believe, all things are possible.